Using my informed personal and professional position, being autistic, having QTLS and a PG cert in autism and various diplomas in autism and psychology, over 20 years in SEND and having trained as an ABA therapist for this assignment, I will explore theory to practice of perceived CB, challenging behaviour, in autis, as I coined us in 2024. What CB is conceptualized and perceived as, why autists are perceived as displaying CB, when behavior is perceived as communication when it might not be, how communication maintains CB perceptions, where interventions to change behavior negatively impact autists, and lastly, some methods that I have designed attempting to rectify centuries of defamation and breaking cycles of toxic neurotypism, I termed in 2024 as a racism of the culture of the mind, on page 13 of my paper, Our Autism Theories, Misconceptions, and subsequently the DSM-5, doing the feminine autism phenotype a deadly disservice. Whilst critiquing CB interventions, ABA in particular, its practices, pros, cons, and ethicality. Clinically, CB is too much unwanted feelings, noise, and not enough obedience and sociability. My autism master's lecturer, Dr. Luke Bearden, asked, why do we go to the GP to be acknowledged, as I call it, as autistics, when we go to them when something is wrong? Autism is neither a mental illness, condition, disorder, nor shall it be in the DSM-5, alternatively in what I coined in 2025, an expected neurodivergence manual, similar to Bearden's Autism Identification Manual. Despite GPs knowing very little about autism, it is to whom parents go to initiate referrals to group homes and or interventions, as the autism industrial complex views autism as a profitable arena to monetize our expected neurotype identities and lived experiences into marketable goods and services through a subterfuge of clinical diagnosis, therapies, and or medications commercialized by healthcare professionals. It's important to note that autism is largely perceived as a disability, with only a quarter of those currently diagnosed having co-occurring ID, intellectual disability, not directly caused by autism. And this statistic also neglects the many higher intellectually functioning autists compared to those with ID, to be late acknowledged, as I called it, in 2025. Society does not prioritize our needs, instead perceiving them as problems to be fixed, as we do not naturally conform to PNT societal norms for prominent neurotype, as I called them in 2024. It is widely known that most, but not all, autism interventions target those with co-occurring ID and perceived CB, perhaps as this minority is even more systematically oppressed, stripped from freedom, choice, and autonomy by those with power of attorney over them. All of these concepts are socially constructed, not biologically predetermined, therefore subjective and in the mind's eye of the observer, inasmuch as, or more than, of from the individual themselves. Nunn-Kussing and Hayden-Laurelat argue that institutions such as group homes and, in my opinion, schools and interventions like ABA are largely the producer of these concepts of ID and CB and discourse of being directly linked to autism. Such narratives shape how people see the world, each other, and us. Some will try and argue that the connection between autism and CB is a complex intersection of biology, communication barriers, and more than some environmental factors. Autism experts and advocates, however, use behavior that challenges, removing the onus from the individual who's just being themselves, reflecting a social model of disability perspective. The neurotype that is currently prominent, as I coined it last year, has historically forced their preferences onto us to what they deem to be normal. But normalcy and the word normal only started being used in the English language around 1840, and it is based on a statistical bell curve that can and should change with time. But instead it has become fixed and an excuse for ableism, interventions, and even eugenics. Pluklek says that the idea of a person who is normal, i.e. a normal person or abnormal, an abnormal person, is a constructed phenomenon. This includes the idea of a normal way of being, living, having a job, etc., to be a valid servant of the community and a useful part of humanity. The power of such subjectively interpreted dominant discourse influences ideas, thoughts, actions, talk, and why interventions like ABA therapy were created, to fix a perceived, narrative-defined, and in mind-for-mind fabricated problem, where written evidence of perceived CB is created in subjective referrals given by institutions of whom hold immense power over people with disabilities. Much the same as for autism and other neurodivergences, my lecturer, Dr. Jill Pluklek, states literature's concept of CB ended up becoming becoming almost like it was a diagnostic category. It became an identity and a reputation of persons with disability. Bluplex says that we label someone challenging because we have decided that the problem resides within the person rather than the circumstance, creating a discourse through which people can exert power and control over them. I surmised as Nunn Kusing and Hayden Laurelet that professionals choose to label autism as a disorder, to insist that we have some innate defiance and deviance from the norm. Rather than embracing neurological differences, ABA, as philosopher Foucault describes, seeks to train autists to discipline themselves into docile beings. As shown in sociologist Goffman's Asylums and Discipline and Punishment, ABA's labels of autism and practices echo Foucault's genealogy of punitive origins and of Goffmanesque enforcement of knowing your place as a powerless minority. Rehabilitation is often associated with addicts and those recovering from injuries, suggesting that we are either injured mentally or otherwise unwell, or implying an inherently rebellious nature towards what most people, the PNT, do, think, say, etc., framed as having gone off track, needing realignment to PNT's straight and narrow ways. ABA is essentially compliance therapy. We must be visible in engaging in challenging behavior rehabilitation or be subject to further intervention referrals, and so the snake bites its tail in what I call the powerless cycle of organizational activity surveillance. Sadly, ABA, much like institutions, ensures that staff too are put in their place, having what I coin as a symbiotic relationship or role. Goffman calls it symbolic interaction, where ABA staff are expected to adjust actions to complement reciprocated expectations. From posts I see on social media, I strongly believe that ABA therapists and parents truly think that they are being charitable and kind by seemingly and innocently teaching autists to do better, as my ABA therapist trainer Alex Lau puts it, in the world. They are fooled and do not see how, although they have some freedom to slightly readjust their roles, when an autist wants to, this is seen as CB, and they are imprisoned to the confines of what others deem as right, bound in a cage with no power in such a dynamic, with no freedom or will or choice of expression. If an ABA therapist were to realize this, however, and tried to give the autist more autonomy or allowed autistic behaviors without consequences, their manager would likely deem them not up to the job. As Goffman puts it, as the greater total institute, the world deems that this imprisonment is necessary, communicated through its social structure, constructs, and its allowance of such interventions for autistically normal human behavior. As ABA requires complete transfer across the entirety of an autist's life, with discourses dictating the aforementioned, much like regimented social systems such as prisons, mental hospitals, military boot camps, where residents are isolated from wider society for extended periods, our total institution is the world. Humans and persons with disabilities and their caregivers in particular are surveyed so heavily already. And now studies are suggesting that BCIs and VR could benefit cognitive training and engaging in recreational activities for the severely paralyzed. But how far could they take it? Some brain-computer interfaces are implanted into brains. Could those with power of attorney over persons with intellectual disability or otherwise be open to every private thought, inhumanely stripping them of the last bit of privacy they have? We already force autists to act counter to themselves through PNT behavior and communication interventions. What better way to control us is for the power dynamic of the government's control of monitoring and surveillance over civilians. Perhaps maybe one day there will be no thought that is hidden or secret. Everyone acts and transmits information, usually with their best intentions, to the best of their ability within their own perspective. The narrative of wrong behavior, particularly in ABA, for just being ourselves, is insidious. Aside from forced masking of autistic authenticity and restricting access to chosen subjects, as I call them, used as bribery, covertly called incentives in schools I've worked in, Bearden says there is no right or wrong way of being, merely a mismatch, that's the issue. Yet ABA, for example, needlessly assigns blame to what I called in 2024 culture of the mind. Challenging as an adjective is seen as a beneficial opportunity to learn, grow, and progress. Ironically, labeling someone as having challenging behavior, we remove their safety and belonging through a lack of acceptance, and we prevent the individual from growing and progressing in a sense of self-actualization. By definition, challenging behavior could easily be seen as an aspirational way to develop as a person. In fact, restrictive, repetitive behaviors that are seen as deficits and pejorative are things that billionaires aspire to. Are we meant to presume that and have the belief that only easy interactions with others are of value, and that only those who say and do what we want are worth our time? That humans are not innately heterogeneous, unique individuals with the right to have different worldviews, experiences, perceptions, sensory needs, social wants, or avoidance, being all perfectly normal and acceptable and understandable. I mean, who wrote such an incohesive hidden rule that everyone must act the same, be the same, and not learn and grow from one another's differences? That anyone who does not conform to are too difficult and need to be penalized for it? Although the NHS says that challenging behaviour is not a medical diagnosis but an umbrella term, it defines it as if it were. Behaviours and actions that create a barrier to learning, socialising, living safely, actions that pose a risk to yourself or others and severely lower your quality of life or exclude you from the community. But by saying someone has challenging behaviour, you do all of these apart from hurting others. And it is for others that interventions are created. As interventions stop us from expressing and learning about ourselves, they interfere with how we are perceived, therefore making people judge and often have an excuse of bullying or abusing us just because we are seen as the challenging ones. Challenging them and making them not want to socialize with us, as well as making us feel unsafe, having to mask like performing seals at a zoo, to not be penalized, posing a risk to us, severely lowering our quality of life through ostracization, marginalization from the community. Surely it is in interventions and the perception of CB linked to autism that is the actual challenging behavior. Sadly, the one synonym that sticks to challenging behavior in autists is difficult. And perhaps that is what it should be called, difficult behavior. But then, obviously, certain things they call difficult behavior might be a bit embarrassing to be called so, as the broad assumption is that challenging behavior is intolerable, negatively impacting others by causing them distress, forcing others to work harder and make more effort than is desirable to be able to tolerate us, such as learning about us, which is not easy and takes dedication, effort, energy, and time, as understanding autism doesn't come naturally and requires others to attempt to relate to what might be unrelatable, making those who do this, however, grow as people. And growth can sometimes be painful, tiring, and stressful, whether mentally, emotionally, or physically. But unlike distress, which is what autists face every day without others compromising, this effort invested in us can be eustress, which is beneficial. The description of difficult, for the most part, also doesn't fit us. Eustress is a positive type of stress experience. For example, when exercising, initially it can be taxing on the body, but when done right for your needs, it can motivate, channel energy, and improve performance, even replenish you as opposed to distress. Of course, it's very utilitarian of me to ask why we can't just accept one another, as we can all get scared of the unknown, autists included, who cannot naturally understand what they don't naturally understand, just like the PNT, as we have differing cognitive processes. But maybe the key is to accept that we will never truly understand autism in as much as the human mind itself. And it does not seem that the PNT's need is to conserve more energy than we do. Having the world set up for them, they are simply less inclined to try, as this effort is undesirable and so further tax and the onus is put on us. Whilst we already struggle with unmet needs, we need the PNT to equitably meet in the middle. Tanovic writes that uncertainty can intensify how threatening a situation feels. As CB appears to cause distress, surely it is threatening behavior, or would that feel too overdramatic for those perceiving autistic communication styles stemming and their distress to say that they're threatened by us? And yet, on the other foot, for autists being perceived as having challenging behavior alone is an actual threat. I feel many societal rules are made around preferences and punitive consequences are selective. And so I agree in part with Lovett that by labeling people's behavior, many feel that they have the right to act on how that person's behavior is affecting them rather than because the person is actually doing something or trying to communicate something. However, by implying that there is always a reason for behavior and that it is always communicative, as Plukelek says, we diminish people as attention seeking, which almost always comes from not taking people seriously as real people. By labeling all actions and reactions as behavior implies conscious goal-orientated intention, often with desire, belief, and or skill, which isn't always present. Humans also act without deliberate intent or communicative purpose. I personally react unintentionally or without intentionally eliciting a response from others. Many autists, in fact, can have tone and gestures or even facial expressions that do not portray their immediate feeling, thought, or just do not portray what they're trying to communicate in the first place. And aside from delay, there can also be a huge disconnect between these. The brain itself is barely understood, much less the autism neurotype, for anyone to assume that all behavior is fully founded with clear cause or a direct response to stimuli or otherwise. Behavior reflects an individual's unique internal world, which I called in 2024 autistic inner world, and their history. Without fully knowing and understanding these, we cannot presume that we understand someone's behavior or their intentions of it. I personally view behavior just as a natural occurrence, present in all living beings and even systems in nature, such as tides, winds, currents. And I don't think all actions need to be framed as stimulus-driven responses. Behavior that is instinctive, absent of known stimuli to the individual and or without intention, to me is just not behavior that you can call communication. Non-stimuli are neutral and irrelevant inputs that do not elicit physical or cognitive responses. To me, when something unconsciously or unintentionally evokes a response in you, it is not a response to stimuli, whereas deliberate removal of external inputs is an anti-stimulus, something often recommended to help with sensory overload or burnout. Biased interpretations of another neurotype's even basic vital behavior, such as if a newborn's known to be autistic and it cries to clear fluid, a PNT may perceive this as a sign of CV. This example seems ridiculous. However, far too often autists' common PNT behaviors are viewed as such, based on the fabricated and perceived association of autism and CB. Example, if I scratch my scalp all the time, sometimes it's just because it feels good, but often I'm oblivious to it, never to communicate anything, even when talking to someone. It has nothing to do with them or the environment. It happens so often it's almost a baseline action. I do have suspected EDS in my shoulders and wrists, but of course it's a stim and no one nor I can say why I do it all the time. Vital behaviors encompass body system regulation, are intuitive, involuntary, unintentional, and essential for survival. Most we couldn't stop even if we wanted to without dying, and if we all did, humans would cease to exist. Other autistic behaviors that can happen unintentionally within our autistic inner world are brainstorming, information gathering, echologia, repeating words and phrases and sounds in your head that you've heard, or palilalia with those of your own, which can result in talking to yourself. Sleep disorders like REM behavior disorder, where I unintentionally kick my partner while sleeping, and soliloquy, where I am insensitive in my words in my sleep, but in waking, I'm an empath. This can be indicative of poor sleep and anxiety, but who truly knows? Behavior can occur whilst internally regulating, processing thoughts and emotions, where autists can have RE, as mentioned, creating a PNT timeline delayed output due to what I call our autist enhanced monotropic processing. These delays can be verbal, emotional, physical, etc., and whilst experiencing emotional memory such as CPTSD with visual, auditory, olfactory, and so on, flashbacks, etc. With the recognition that non-stimuli, neutral or no stimuli responses and behavior often being unconscious and unintentional, I would therefore say that counter to Bearden's golden equation, autism plus environment doesn't always equal outcome. In 1913, John Watson identified observable behavior as the proper subject for psychology, presuming that all behavior is controlled by environmental events. Behaviorists may accept the existence of cognition and emotions, but choose not to study them, as it's assumed that only observable behavior can be objectively and scientifically measured. Is it power they want? After sharing my experiences and observations of other autists with Jill, we agreed that in many cases autist behavior has nothing to do with communication. It might just be about physical and intuitive regulatory processes. Rose writes that if you perceive behavior as challenging, then you, as an individual, are more likely to suffer the consequences. Behaviorism requires objective observation. But how can ABA therapists or any human truly be objective observers of another's behavior with their own frame of reference, not using their own theory of mind or central coherence, considering their own personal lived experiences, trauma, personality, feelings, preconceptions, or presumptions of autism or anyone else, which as an holistic would likely be inaccurate as we are different. Though I beg even still, a lot of autists will have inaccurate assumptions about another autist, as we are intrinsically heterogeneous. Looking at autistic humans as a black box is basically an IT specialist trying to look at a computer, assuming that we are somehow like robots, with input and output as functions without any soul or inner world. Behaviorism, like ABA, doesn't take into account our delayed and output responses, such as with RE. Far too often in ABA, our behaviors are misinterpreted as tantrums or non-compliance or confrontational. Some autists will be forced to adapt to new routines. If they say need surgery on their broken foot, not running marathons for a while due to unintentional damage, even with repeated self-harm by not letting themselves heal. Equally, there are other forms of self-harm that are intentional, deliberate destruction as written in a bright red scream, self-mutilation and the language of pain, where this is the only way to get the stimulation we need. Unlike banging your head against a wall, the sharp sensation of cutting, for most part, creates superficial damage to the epidermis, and with most not intending to go deep or vertical to attempt suicide, and with a fresh blade and kept clean, it comfortingly heals, almost with the hope that your anguish and turmoil in time will too. Although it may be unpleasant and incomprehensible to many onlookers, particularly if others' blood makes you squeamish, it can release endorphins and help with imbalances in dopamine and serotonin. It can ground you when you feel disassociated and numb, bringing you back to your body and giving you control over what hurts you. When you feel that everything is out of control and overwhelming in what I call a soul pain. And it is that way of recognizing and acknowledging, even processing your distress and crisis, particularly for those who have internalized their trauma and emotional and or mental pain for far too long. Only those who have felt compelled to do this will truly understand, and how much it really does help us survive such torment. None of us live in a vacuum. Families and their opinions matter. Each of us has our limitations, and the effort expected of us via PNT must be met in the middle, where actually the PNT would be able to compromise more, but chooses not to. Not because they can't, but because it takes energy. Requiring that we change ourselves doesn't help anyone, as we need to fit in too. But how can we fit in if we can't fit into ourselves because we're not permitted to? Interventions aim to relieve the challenge holistics feel from our behaviour, whilst neglecting that autists have heterogeneous thoughts, intentions, or even no intent in our behaviour, much less to challenge. Behaviourism incessantly drills into the autist that their natural way of being is wrong. Wrong choice, as Alex Lau, my ABA trainer, exclaimed over and over again when the autist in his care did not comply with his expectations. During my teacher training 20 years ago, I was taught about Skinner's behaviorism and Pavlovian conditioning, originally used as dog training, to help with education, learning, and order in class, although it never felt as distasteful or seemed as sinister as ABA training. And the chaos behaviorism seeks to control is part of being human. It gives us creativity and resilience to grow and develop as beings, aiding rapid adaptivity to environmental shifts and our own complex emotions. Taking these away from us makes us no more than robots, which is how behaviorism views its subject, observing functions, not soul. In ABA, behaviorism is used with autists much as it was originally intended as dog training, dehumanizing in association, training autists' behavior, as Lau puts it, as if we are animals, depersonalizing us further by saying there is no cure for autism currently, like we are a pack of infectious vermin. It feels reminiscent of Hitler's Jew race hygiene in the Nazi era, where the infamous Asperger, who is said to have tried to fix autism by sending autists with GDD, ID, or perceived CB to the notorious Amtsspiegelgrund, a euthanasia clinic in Vienna, as a way of training and or eradicating autists, though his family have invested a lot to create studies to prove otherwise. No matter how effective behaviorism in ABA and or positive behavioral support may be in improving adaptive functioning, it is limited and constrained in its execution and unsettling. The problem is that it encourages rote behavior performed automatically without active thought, critical analysis, or intrinsic motivation, no deep understanding, described as teaching without thinking or operating on autopilot, leaving autists completely reliant on pre-learnt scripts, grooming vulnerability. Almost all of its benefits can be done without behaviorism. Although ABA has some of the most studies conducted on it, being a fancy, difficult, and dramatic intervention, as Pluclet puts it, ABA should be noted as also having some of the highest rates of conflicts of interest, with the vast majority of authors holding shares and connected interest in positive outcomes, and even those who are deemed to be peer-reviewed, evidence-based facts can have bad science, often done by bad pharma, as Ben Oldacre books call it. Many studies are like sales pitches, where p-hacking can manipulate statistical practices, dropping data points from research, test data, etc., to achieve statistically significant results, creating false positives, just like having non-randomized but carefully selected group participants. When talking about challenging behavior, I dare you change the word autism or autistic challenging behavior to say white challenging behavior, black challenging behavior, Indian challenging behavior, choosing another culture and saying that that individual must be trained to not have their culture's stereotypical and unfavorable behaviors in our country. And in the case of autists, that means the world. To me, ABA is an antiquated intervention. Even using the word intervention suggests that we are being surrounded by a bunch of friends because we have some sort of addiction. It's to target our distress or behaviors that are not deemed as capitalistically appropriate. When attempting to understand the difference between positive behavioral support, PBS, and ABA, I realized that PBS is still very much applied behavioral analysis, focusing on behaviors that need to be changed or reduced, such as restrictive practices. And although it focuses on addressing root causes and tries to have individuals who are over 16 who give permission, these individuals still feel pressured by society to meet PNT norms. And therefore, the whole consensus is that our behavior is still not appropriate and we are not appropriate. Even though it focuses on core values and inclusion and human rights, it is still focused on behavioral science. And the improvement to our quality of life is around how we fit in with others, not within ourselves. ABA, having had much criticism over the years, has changed dramatically in its approaches, highlighting that you must not yell, shout, or hit children. Instead, it uses incentives as coercion. It is concerning how ABA also links rewards as positive reinforcement, as this can create things like obesity rates going up in autistic individuals, where we strongly associate achievement and being good with food. After completing my ABA training when preparing for this assignment, I read this amazing article by David Gray Hammond and felt I could have written it myself. As Gray Hammond writes, ABA is 100% compliance training and is so dangerous. It teaches autistic children who are already at higher risk of abuse that their no will be ignored, their discomfort is irrelevant, and that their body exists for the expectations of others. Being groomed for vulnerability is exactly how I would put it, and this is why ABA can never be neuroaffirming, nor PBS truly, as it strips away agency training to override its own signals, not allowing nor promoting consent literacy, self-trust, and boundary recognition. Individuals subjected to ABA suffer consequences if they do not comply, including taking away basic needs. Whilst already having taken away free will, self-expression, autonomy, and never considering feelings, needs, wants, desires, opinions, unique perspectives, and concluded logical views of the autist. It does not foster self-advocacy, speaking up against those who oppress us, creating our own boundaries or knowing limitations, and what is personally detrimental to our well-being, or self-awareness of our emotions, bodily needs, thoughts, or how to process these, and our independence to meet our own needs or teach ourselves, such as being autodidactal, is removed, as well as our intrinsic motivation, relying completely on prompts and focusing on rote learning. From my ABA training with Alex Lau, ABA therapy to me appears to be like having a manipulative and controlling narcissistic parent who only loves you when you act the way they want and think the way they believe to be right, even when it's counterintuitive to your authenticity. It endorses the ill treatment and willful neglect of identity, individuality, freedom of speech and thought, and according to the Criminal Justice and Courts Act of 2015, this goes against the Mental Capacity Act of 2005, as autists with ID who are forced into such interventions are not allowed to resist it, and if they do, they are met with consequences, depriving them of things that make them happy and give them quality of life. This, according to this law, is psychological abuse, which in relationships is recognized as a criminal offense if it involves a vulnerable person. In ABA, autists are not able to advocate and debate their objections to a tightly controlled environment of reward and punishment. Here, although ABA therapists may claim that they have reports and that they care, it is within a very performative environment. Autists are trained to depend on prompts, almost completely reliant on them, fostering helplessness and vulnerability. They are removed of developing intrinsic motivation and have no autonomy. These are the huge flaws of ABA. A lot of people project their views of self onto others, and what is expected to be natural or acceptable and normal are often the biggest barriers to acceptance and understanding of autism. If we just ask, I wonder why they, rather than questioning and judging everything that we do. For centuries, autists have been dominated and pressured and trained into denying our authenticity, but we should not be forced into PNT social expectations that take a toll on us and lead to meltdowns, shutdowns, and burnout, or even suicide. We are not weak for being overwhelmed by sensory and social experiences, as Whitcomb Marsh says. This is autism. Autists deserve the right to manage and limit their exposure to situations that we predict to be overstimulating. Last year I was trying to come up with a name to define my concept of xenophobic racism of culture of the mind worldwide of expected neurotypes, as I called us in 2025. Like Lab, I came up with neurotypism. Lab and I define neurotypism as a PNT systemic bias, privilege, and oppression over a minority with legitimate human identities. In a world where the neurotype modes of functioning of the one that is prominent at the moment, but that could change one day, only their social expectations, communication styles, and output speeds are seen as normal, marginalizing our neurodivergence from these, othering us, and implying that our expected neurotypes are foreign in a xenophobic way. Worst of all, unlike other cultures, our culture of the mind is sent to isolation in institutions, and yet there are laws to protect other cultures that have expression of ethnic groups, here in the UK and of other countries. But autists, who are still people, are trained to suppress our culture of the mind as if uncivilized. Like how Westerners may turn their nose up at an Indian person or other cultures that eat rice with their hands in the UK, and yet you wouldn't dare create interventions to fix their behaviour about anything to do with their culture. This sort of snobbery assumes PNT as superior, looking down on autistic culture of mind and innate and natural autistic behaviours, and ABA focuses on these observable behaviours, ignoring our cognition, removing our very essence of understanding what CB and autism could be, and treating us like robots. And yes, I firmly believe that it is only holistics that can fix any so-called CB instantly by choosing to open their eyes, hearts, and minds to another's perspective, neutralizing any warped perceptions of socially constructed challenges. If holistics can release control over us and their dictatorship that marginalizes and ostracizes us through relinquishing an entitled ownership and a maladaptive godlike need to intrusively and ancestrously and incessantly survey and censor our every thought, behavior, and communication style, instead embrace scientifically proven neurotype biodiversity, humanely allowing equitable and ethical supports for all, holistics and autistics, to meet everyone's uniquely heterogeneous needs. In the end, by not resisting humanity's neurodiverse spectrum, this requires less effort from all to make humanity comfortable and be able for each of us to have the feeling of being treated as a fully human person. My novel concept of double empathy training with autism intensive immersion interaction experience training, ITE, focusing on social and other interactions, including immersive integrated sensory awareness training, ISAT, came about when I suddenly became deaf in my left ear last September from an untreated tooth infection. Whilst trying to explain to my partner and full-time carer Hayden how much of a sensory nightmare it is to be equally hyposensitive in my hearing and yet have extreme hypersensitivity with never-ending intrusive tinnitus invasively affecting my every waking and likely sleeping moment, on top of my previous auditory processing and delay differences. ISAT aims not just to increase awareness and understanding, promoting cognitive, motivational, and compassionate empathy of sensory sensitivities, but also for those who are capable, emotional, affective empathy, bringing about true comprehension. Instead of common accusations of exaggerating our experiences, being called a drama queen, as my nan frequently called me, overly sensitive, demanding, or intentionally being difficult as defined by institutions, but it is undoubtedly easier for the PNT to make minor changes that can help us immensely and in turn help them.